Hi, guys, and welcome to SAT Hacked. I'm Matt Kleinstiver, and I'm going to be your host over this series. So, really excited to have you here. Before I get into today's content, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the series and what the goal is. So, the biggest problem with SAT tutoring and SAT education in general is that SAT books and SAT videos like this one don't actually use real SAT questions. Companies like the Princeton Review and Barron's write their own questions, and honestly, they typically do a pretty bad job of it. So I wanted to create a series that's based around official, real SAT questions written by the College Board. And I've had my students kind of help me find questions that are in particular categories. So today's video, first video in the series, is going to be about combining sentences questions. And I want to thank my student Nora for helping me kind of, get all of those, find all of those combining sentences questions across many SATs so that I could all put them all together and talk to you guys about the deep patterns that you can recognize inside these questions. It's my hope that after today's lesson, you'll have a really good shot at getting these questions correct. You'll have some great strategies that you can use to answer these questions. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So what is a combining sentences question? Well, the first thing I'll tell you is that these questions are actually pretty easy to identify, okay? Why is that? Well, they actually say something like combine the sentence right in the question, what we call the question stem, right? That little piece of text that kind of gives you, that you see in some questions that introduces the question to you. So you'll see something like which choice most effectively combines the sentences right in the question stem. It's going to include that language. It's at least going to have combine and sentence in it. So they're easy to identify, which is nice. Now, another key point about them that I want to make is that these are expression of ideas questions. Let me just get a pen here, or highlighter. So these are expression of ideas questions. And what I mean by that, sorry for that bad highlight, what I mean by that is we say that on the SAT writing test, there are two types of questions. There are what are known as standard English convention questions, and those test your knowledge of punctuation, grammar, um, those kinds of things. So you're looking at subject-verb agreement, you're looking at dangling modifiers, you're looking at those kinds of things. Now, combining sentences questions, one of the important things to realize is that all of the answer choices are really grammatically correct. There's nothing that horrible about the grammar. I mean, there's not going to be subject-verb agreement. There are not going to be punctuation errors in these questions. So don't focus on that so much. Now, you still are going to have to use some of your standard English convention skills. Like you're still going to have to think a little bit about dangling modifiers. And if any of these terms aren't familiar to you, don't worry. We're going to be covering it all over the video. So big idea, big takeaway there is don't try to analyze these from a punctuation or a grammar perspective because most of the answer choices are going to be, in fact, almost all of the answer choices are going to be grammatically correct. I haven't seen an exception to that. It doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but I just haven't seen it happen. Wrong answer choices in this kind of question are going to structure information poorly. So there's not going to be good, what we call logical coordination between ideas, okay? We'll see what that means in just a little bit. So just wanted to show you some other kind of ways that this question might be phrased. Now, question 42 was a really unique version of the style of question, and it stuck out in my mind as I saw it. We'll be looking at that a little bit later, but notice it still has that word. It's longer than your typical stem, but it still has that word combine in it and sentence in it. And this shows you kind of the full way that one of these questions looks. So which choice best combines the underlined sentences? And yeah, there you have your options. So your strategies for taking on this type of question. There are going to be 6 strategies that I'm going to talk about over the video. Your number one strategy is to make a prediction. So when you see two sentences that kind of have underlines linking them on the test, and we'll be looking at some examples. Try to make a prediction about the best way to combine those sentences without looking at the answer choices, right? And that's one of our key strategies across the entire SAT verbal section, which is predicted answers are often good. Wrong answer choices, once you start looking at them, they kind of, I say, poison the well, or at least get in your head in such a way as to make you think, oh, that sounds kind of right now. So avoid looking at all the answers until you've made a prediction. Next thing I'd like you to think about, shorter answers are usually better. Shorter is better, and that's true across the whole SAT writing section. That, we're often looking out for, concision, what's called concision. I often tell my students a story. When I was in college, sometimes my professors would say, we want a paper and it's going to be due tomorrow and it's going to have to be 1,000 words or 500 words. And we'd all groan. We say, oh, I don't really want to do it. So we'd go home that night, and when we started writing the paper, we would say things like, I myself personally, as an individual, do truly feel, think, believe, right? And so we're just using really repetitive language, and we're not actually bringing any new ideas in, right? We're just kind of circling around the same ideas just to extend the word length. And the SAT really doesn't want you to do that, okay? That's not considered good writing. And so across the entirety of the writing test, shorter answers are usually better. And we're going to see that principle in play in a huge way in these combining sentences questions, okay? And so this is one of your, for a low scoring student, if you're not sure what to do at all, just go with the shortest answer here. That will get you probably, 60% of these questions. Is it always going to work? No. Okay, but it is one of your top strategies. Now, the next thing that you need to do is consider the logical relationship of the information in the sentence. We'll be talking more about this over the course of the video, but when we want to structure information in an English sentence, we typically want to put important things at the beginning of the sentence, and we don't want to put important information, say, between commas or between dashes or between parentheses, or toward the end in what's called a subordinate clause, something like a comma plus who or a comma plus which. You don't want to put important ideas in those locations. Now, pay attention to transition words like therefore, however, but, right? Conjunctions that help you to arrange information logically and show the logical relationship between elements of a sentence. And we on the SAT, we do have transition word questions, right? And some combining sentences questions are actually transition questions in disguise. And so definitely pay attention to those transition words, and that goes along with our strategy 3. The next thing you'll want to do is avoid the word being, okay? And that's something, again, that's true across the SAT writing section, that the word being is often a no-no word. In fact, I have a tattoo that if you stick around for later in the video, I'll show you of the word being with a line through it. So, and I often show it to my students to say, this word is a no-no word on the SAT. So avoid the word being. Avoid passive constructions, and if you don't know what that means, if you never heard passive voice, we'll talk about that, and other awkward phrasing, okay? And we'll talk about what makes something awkward. Now, often the best solution for one of these questions is to use a colon, okay? Colons are a great way to show logical relationship and to set up an explanation or set up an additional detail. So that is going to be our final strategy. So let's get started and look at some of these questions. So strategy 1, as we said, make a prediction. Let's take a look. So what we're looking at now is what's known as the context paragraph. So we're basically seeing, what the question is asking us to do, okay, or what it's asking us to unite. Notice that 2 full sentences are underlined here. You may see that. You may see a situation where say only, let me just get the highlight here, say only this part is underlined. Either way, the principle that you're going to follow is pretty similar, okay? Now, one of the things that I'd like you to do, right, as our top strategy is let's just read this and try to combine these sentences ourselves without looking at all the College Board's crazy possible ways of combining them, right? Let's just try to combine them ourselves. So let's read the sentences. Instead, most regular patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing. They do this often shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar. Okay, well, as I read this, I see one word that I really don't like, and that's this, okay? I often tell my students that this, that, these, and those, okay, are really bad words when they're by themselves, okay? And that last part is key, when they're by themselves. I actually, when I was having students write SAT essays, I banned them from using the word this or that or these by itself. If you're going to use this kind of word, no pun intended, then you're going to need to put a noun next to it. Right now, it's kind of vague. What does this refer to, right? And if we're going to get really grammatically specific about this, oh gosh, the groans. Okay, if we're going to get specific about this, the word this, then you got to realize that if you're going to refer to an action, right? You can't really refer to an action if we're being really strict about grammar with a word like this, that, these, or those, okay? So this and this means here like drinking their coffee standing. They drink their coffee standing. And really, if we're going to be grammatically picky, you've got to say they do so. You can't say they do this. So our big goal, if we're going to combine these two sentences, to get rid of this, like these kind of vague words like this and that, right, that don't specifically refer back to a noun, okay? Don't specifically refer back to an actual thing, okay? So, all right, that being said, how could we link this up? Let's just think about it. Okay, so most regular patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing. What if I just deleted this and said standing shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar? That could make sense, right? I could just delete they do this. Why do I need to say they do this? Standing shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar. That makes good sense to me. Other options, maybe we could say something like most regular patrons of a cafeteria stand shoulder to shoulder as they drink their coffee. So yeah, so maybe something like what I've written down here. So instead, most regular patrons of a cafeteria stand shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar as they drink their coffee. That could work. Or instead, most regular patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, so just kind of deleting out this unnecessary they do this, right? We can say standing shoulder to shoulder instead of saying they do this often shoulder to shoulder, and that kind of aligns with our strategy too, which is that shorter is better. All right, so let's see if our prediction kind of goes along with one of these answer choices. So instead, we said most regular patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing shoulder to shoulder. Is there anything like that? Okay, so I like A because it's okay, at least we're starting off with most regular patrons. And as we'll talk about later, it's good to start with, it looks like they're all starting with most regular patrons. That's good, okay, of a cafeteria. So I'm just kind of scanning to see where our breaks are, right? So where different answer choices kind of diverge. Drink their coffee standing, often shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar. Now, something like B, I'm probably going to eliminate. This adding in like which they do seems to me to be unnecessary or kind of like repetitive, right? Mentioning the subject again and again. And that's one thing you'll notice across a lot of these questions, that they bring the subject back in, like they bring in these pronouns when there's no need to do it. So I'm always looking out for like the repetition of pronouns. C does this as well, like they do it. Again, stuff like it kind of works like this and that, where this is kind of a ambiguous pronoun is the fancy term. We don't really know what it is. The fact that they drink their coffee, it's not really specific. And again, this repeats that they. Now, what about D? Most regular patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing shoulder to shoulder at a counter or bar. Drink their coffee shoulder to shoulder or at a counter or bar. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. But then I'm kind of worried about this standing there instead, right? This putting instead at the end of this really changes the logical flow of the sentence, right? Now, we don't really have our context from before. Let me see if we can get a little bit about this. If we had a little bit more context, we might be able to see better that we're talking about a situation that's, rather than, sitting down, right? They're standing. So, a little bit more context might have been helpful for us to realize where the logical placement of this transition word is. But notice that A does align pretty well with our original prediction. The only difference is I think I got rid of this, often, right? So yeah, so instead, most patrons of a cafeteria drink their coffee standing, and then at a counter or bar. This often shoulder to shoulder can logically kind of describe the way that they're standing. So choice A is correct. Circle that. Okay. Yeah, and then the other point that I wanted to make here, guys, is that, be careful about where modifier phrases are being placed. Like ing phrases, for instance, like here, often standing shoulder to shoulder, right, seems like it's describing coffee, right? Which is, this is like a modifier placement issue. We want to say that, so be careful about stuff like that. Yeah. All right. So we've already talked about this to a certain degree, but we'll just zoom in on this idea a little bit here. So shorter options are often better in this kind of question. So what I want to first look at, this is just a pure what's called a redundancy or concision question, right? Where you're looking out for, how I said before, I myself personally as an individual, right? You're looking out for that repetition of words, and if you can recognize this style of question, and I'll do a video about this at some point, your best choice in 95% of the case is just to choose the shortest answer, okay? Because, to identify them, you first look for a repetition of words. Highlighter here. So you look for a repetition of words like yearly and annually mean the same thing, right? So you can't have both of those words together, right? That's repetitive, like saying I myself personally. And we notice that in a lot of these answer choices. Each year and yearly, and each year and annual mean the same thing. Yearly and annually mean the same thing. And so therefore, the correct answer is, oh, I'm having some issues here. The correct answer is P. The correct answer is C, rather. All right. So yeah, you can use the same skills on a lot of these transition word questions. And one of the really nice things to think about is using a comma plus an ing phrase to unite these sentences. Let's just take a look at this combining sentences question here. So for example, when a reader pulls one tab in Megendorfer's book, Always Jolly, a naturalist's arm swings a butterfly net downward, just as the butterfly takes off from a flower, period. This, okay, notice again, what is this, right? SAT does not like this by itself. Okay, it does not like this. If it said this action, that would be better. But using the word this is not a good way to start a sentence. Okay, so this causes the would-be Lepidopterist mouth to drop open and his eyes to look up in dismay. So, one good way to combine these ideas, and the SAT's preferred way to combine two sentences, is to use a comma plus ing. Okay, so A is the correct answer here. And notice that it's also the shortest answer. The SAT prefers this because it's the shortest way to link two ideas. Now, as far as why some other answers are wrong, again, I want you guys to focus in on these pronouns like it, this, these, that. The reader doesn't know what it is. It causes, right? If you're going to use a pronoun like it on the SAT, it needs to refer back to a specific noun. It cannot refer back to an action. Unless there's a specific thing like the butterfly causes, no, it's the fact that the butterfly takes off from the flower, but there's no central noun that this it is referring back to. So B is wrong. Now for C, something that causes, okay, well, A and C really show have the same logical situation, describe the same situation. But A does it in a shorter way. Again, something is kind of like a pronoun, like it. So we're going to avoid it. D, as a result, this causes. Okay. Now, let's just think about the logic here, in terms of like, isn't this a bit repetitive to say, as a result, this causes? If something causes something else, it's necessarily as a result of that thing, right? So, if I say the hot sun causes ice to melt, or, that's the same as saying, as a result of the heat of the sun, ice melts, right? So this is repetitive phrasing. Let's get rid of it. Okay. I'll let you guys try the next one. I'll give you just a minute here to give it a shot. All right, so hopefully you were able to quickly answer that. If you had to rapid fire answer it, and let's say you just have 1 second left on the SAT or 5 seconds left, you choose D, right, as a shorter is better option. As far as why some of these other answer choices are wrong, right, we said that we want to avoid using pronouns if we don't have to, right, and avoid repeating terms like costume curators, that is to say, costume curators are, right? These came back again. So I hope you kind of get a feel for why all of these wrong answers are wrong. And as long as you recognize that, grammatically, you can just put a comma. This is called an appositive. We won't really talk about that, but this is just like a non-essential phrase that gives a little bit more detail about something. Like if I said, let's see if I can get I'm not going to do that. All right, but if I say something like, one of the things that you can notice is this comma after D really just means that this final bit is set up as a kind of parenthetical. It's telling you that it's non-essential. In other words, you could delete all this information. Um, and, we could just basically say um, the term, such exhibits are overseen, created and overseen by costume curators. And then we could just have a period there, really, right? We know that that's a full sentence. Putting a comma here just lets us know that this is kind of like giving a definition of the word. And it's the same as putting, this information in parentheses. We'll talk more about that idea later in the series, but I hope everything kind of is making sense to you guys. So this is D. That is to say is a really repetitive phrase, by the way. I would avoid that for the most part in a question like this. All right, we're on to strategy 3, which is we're thinking about logical relationships between elements in the sentence. Let's get started. So one of the big points that I've already made is that key ideas and actors should typically come at the beginning of a sentence. They shouldn't come in interruptions. In other words, they shouldn't come between, say, dashes or in parentheses or at the end of the sentence, in those kinds of places. The other thing I'd like you to do is be aware of the placement of modifiers. So if we're talking about, say, an ing phrase, speaking as a experienced tutor, comma, speaking as an experienced tutor, in comma, right? That ing phrase is a modifier phrase, right? And it's describing someone or describing something. Make sure that modifiers like that, and this could be adjectives, right? It could be, some people call these adjective phrases. Make sure that they're coming close to the things that they're describing, okay? That's often important in this kind of question. So let's just look at our answer choices here, and they're pretty long. So we'll read this over a little bit. Okay, so before beginning their careers, many volunteer at animal shelters or veterinary clinics, and then attend college to attain a degree in zookeeping or a related field such as biology or ecology. Most zookeepers identify closely with their profession and consider their work morally important. These findings about zookeepers are demonstrated in a study by business professors J. Stewart Bunderson and Jeffrey Thompson. Bunderson and Thompson asked 982 zookeepers from 157 different zoos to respond to statements about their work. Okay. Now, let's take a look at these answer choices. And let's just kind of like notice what comes at the beginning. So this one really highlights the findings of the studies, okay, and kind of puts that at the center. Options B and C really put the study kind of like up at the top and kind of focus on the study itself. And then D focuses on zookeepers themselves. So we've got different focus, right, based on what's coming first in the sentence. Now, choice A does something that we're going to talk about later as being kind of bad, which is rather than saying that a study demonstrates findings, it says two findings are demonstrated in a study, right? It's better, right? It strikes me that when I'm looking at this, that the focus should be on the study, not the findings. And this is what's known as passive, and we'll talk about passive structure a little bit later. So two findings about zookeepers, and then putting the comma here and putting this other information inside this kind of like, comma separated portion suggests that it's not key. It's like a side point. So, okay, we'll come back to this one, but those are the issues that I'm looking at now. I don't like it right now for those reasons. Let's look at B. A study by business professors J. Stewart Bunderson and Jeffrey Thompson. Okay, not bad. We're starting off with a study. A study that focused on zookeepers. Well, I'm often looking out for like the repetition of ideas. So this seems repetitive. I wonder if there's a better way to like unite this rather than just saying a study, right? That seems kind of repetitive. Okay, but let's keep going. Demonstrates that most zookeepers identify closely with their profession and consider their work morally important. Okay, altogether, this looks pretty good, right? I don't think this is horrible. I don't like that a study that focused on, but other than that, maybe. C, as a study by business professors J. Stewart Bunderson and Jeffrey Thompson demonstrates, okay, most zookeepers identify closely with their profession and consider their work morally important. This strikes me as being very similar to B, but it avoids that repetition of a study, and so it's shorter. And uh, yeah, that makes me think that it might be better. Now let's look at D. Most zookeepers, found in a study by business professors J. Stewart Bunderson and Jeffrey Thompson to identify closely with their profession, also consider their work morally important. I don't like this one at all. The focus of this sentence is on the study, right? We're introducing the study by Bunderson and Thompson. And so that should be the primary focus, not the zookeepers. This makes the study the secondary point. Other issues here is that, like, the issue here is that when you say the zookeepers, most zookeepers, and then you kind of describe them as found in a study, it almost suggests that only the zookeepers that were found in the study consider their work morally important, not the point that, you know, zookeepers in general find their work important. This makes it almost sound like only the zookeepers that they studied found their work important, and not that the study has like the broad implication that all zookeepers find their work morally important. So our answer here is C. It's got a nice kind of like conjunction at the beginning to unify those ideas. As the study found, this was the case. All right. Now, we're coming back up to a question that I first kind of previewed on our second slide. And I said, you know, this is a pretty rare question, and it's something that, you know, we might see more of on the SAT in the future. It's a combining sentences question, but notice how long it is. It's much longer than you typically see in a combining sentences question, just this question stem, right? But I really like this question because it basically, like, the instructions here are instructions you should be thinking about across many combining sentences question, right? It directly tells you, hey, pay attention to what's central and what's not central, which is something that you need to be thinking about across all combining sentences question, or at least across many of them. So it says, what combines the sentences in a way that makes clear that carbon atoms are central and hydrogen and oxygen atoms are not? All right, I'm going to start by looking at, say, an option D. So in conjunction with the carbon atoms from the, I'm not going to say that, this sample also had used oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule. All right, now we've got to decide, okay, the carbon atoms are more central. Well, this does put carbon atoms first, so maybe that shows that they're more central, but it doesn't really, you know, so I'll put a maybe there, right? Because if we want to show something central, we do want to probably bring it to the beginning of the sentence rather than having it in the middle or the end. All right, let's take a look at C. So the frame of the sugar glucose had been constructed in this sample using not only the carbon atoms from the CO2, but also the hydrogen and oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule. Well, you know, my problem with something like this is that using a construction like not only but also doesn't necessarily imply that the first thing that you say is more important than the second thing. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily show that carbon atoms are you know, more central. Maybe just a little bit because they're coming first, but I don't feel like it's like super strong, a super strong way of saying carbon atoms are more central. All right, let's look at B. Okay, well now it's the first thing in the sentence. Okay, so carbon atoms from the CO2 and oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule had been used to construct the frame of the sugar glucose in this sample. Okay, so the carbon's coming first, but this, setting things up with and kind of suggests that they're all equal parts in this. I wonder if there's a way to really show that the carbon atoms are the primary elements and these other parts are not that important or less important. All right, so you guys probably see where this is headed. A does this really nicely. Why? Well, A puts carbon atoms first, yeah, like a lot of these others do. I mean, it's not quite as early as in B. But the main thing that it does is use these dashes, right? To really, the dashes, remember that dashes on the SAT were kind of like parentheses, right? They're saying that this information is parenthetical. It's not as central, right? Or not as important, right? And so A is our correct answer because this basically says this stuff is less important than the carbon. And it does that, those dashes are one of the most direct ways of doing it. If these had been parentheses, same thing. Even if these had been commas, right, the same principle would apply. Okay, great. All right. Next thing I'd like you guys to do is to focus on your transition words when you're dealing with these combining sentences questions. So again, this isn't a combining sentence question, it's a transition words question, but the principles that you can use to solve transition word and combining, you can use similar principles in both styles of question. And your primary strategy, let me just show you this. So I'm going to cross this word off, right? This is actually your primary strategy for a transition question, which is ignore the transition that's there, read the sentences, and then come up with try to analyze what the logical relationship between the parts are. So in this case, this photograph displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City was taken in 1867. It feels immediate, as if the subject were staring back at the viewer in the present moment. Okay, so what I'm noticing is perhaps a contrast, right? Even though this is from 1867, right, it seems like it's happening right now. So this should be a contrast. And so I've kind of predicted that relationship. Now I'll look at my answer choices. Was taken in 1867. So it feels immediate, as if its subject were staring back. I don't think so. Notice so. That was I kind of crossed that off. Let me clear it up if I could. So notice so. Let's see. And how about while it feels immediate? As if while it feels immediate. I mean, that can show contrast. So I would go between while and although. Since and so really kind of, because it feels immediate, no, we want the contrast. So B and C have that contrast potentially. But although strikes me as kind of setting up the contrast a little bit better. The museum was taken in, the photograph was taken in 1867, although it feels immediately. So even though it was taken in 1867, it feels like it's taken in the present. C is our correct answer. You're going to use the same strategy when you're dealing with these combining sentences questions. Let's take a look at that. So here we've got a logical relationship too. They are typically small, measuring only a few inches and weigh less than an ounce. They have voracious appetites. A salamander eats on average the equivalent of 20 ants, 1 beetle, and 2 beetle larvae per day. Okay, so they've got huge appetites, and I think we're looking at a similar logical relation, right? Even though they're small, they still eat a lot. So there's that contrast here as well. Let's see if we have an answer choice that aligns with that. Yeah, it's pretty direct, right? The only choice that shows that contrast is A. Let's examine why some of these other choices are wrong. So they are typically small, measuring only a few inches and weigh less than an ounce. After they have voracious appetites, no, it's not about a time sequence, right? It's not saying they've got the voracious appetites first and then after that they're small. No. Um, and they're not small because of their appetites. They're small in spite of them. Um, this does not, so the fact that they're small does not lead to their appetites, right? There's no necessary relationship between being small and having a large appetite. In fact, the relationship might be the opposite, that typically if you're small, you don't have the biggest appetite because you don't need that much energy to support your body. All right. All right, strategy 5, avoid awkward phrasing. Now, that sounds kind of broad, but I'm going to try to zoom in on some key awkward elements. So one thing that I want you to do is to avoid passive constructions. And let's just talk about what that means. So in an active construction, you've got a sentence that's starting off with a subject, and then you've got your verb, and then you've got your object. So we say something like, the boy eats the chicken wings, right? We've got the actor, the person that's doing something at the beginning of the sentence. And that's really nice, okay? And that's something that's preferred across the writing test, okay? So not just in combining sentences questions, but across the writing tests, active constructions tend to be better, okay? Again, something like this, the boy is eating the chicken wing, still puts the boy up in the actor seat, right? Up at the front of the sentence. Passive constructions kind of reverse the order of the sentence, and they put the object of the sentence, the thing that's receiving the action, up at the beginning. So if we say the chicken wings are eaten by the boy, or the chicken wings are what are eaten by the boy, these aren't as good, right? Because the actor's all the way here at the end. And I kind of jokingly saying bye to buy, right? So one of the key ways of recognizing these passive constructions, they often have the word buy in them. And so I couldn't help myself. If you want to remember this rule, maybe listen to, I'm showing my age here, the NSYNC song Bye Bye Bye. And then maybe you'll never forget, say bye bye to the word buy, okay? Because it's not good often in these questions if it's setting up a passive construction. Another example of a passive construction, putting this whole action first, eating the chicken wings is what the boy is doing. Notice how that lengthens out the sentence by, including things like what and is doing. So this kind of goes along with shorter is better because a lot of these passive constructions are unnecessarily wordy. They're longer than they really need to be to express the information. So let's take a look at this, and I'm going to let you guys go ahead and eliminate 3 of these answers that are passive. So go ahead and just take a minute and try to do that. Okay, so let's just take a look at the original sentence here. So he found that female finches tend to choose males with loud, high-pitched improvisational songs. These males are chosen over those with soft, low-pitched, predictable songs. Honestly, the original set of sentences isn't that bad. It doesn't feel that awkward compared to some of them, right? It doesn't feel that repetitive. So that's kind of interesting. Now, in terms of finding those passive answers, bye, right? So males, let's take a look at choice B. Males tend to be ones. Okay, this idea of ones, that's like a bad pronoun and repetitive. Chosen by, why not put the female finches up at the top? Okay, So this is passive. Males tend to be ones chosen by females. Why not say female finches tend to choose males? No. Loud, high-pitched improvisational songs are sung by males. Okay, again, this is passive. Males, that female finches tend to choose. Okay, so we've got a lot of passivity happening. We've got, rather than saying males sing these songs, we're saying that these songs are sung by males. And then rather than putting the female finches up at the beginning, and it's kind of like they're the ones that are like kind of the main actors here, we're putting the focus on songs. Okay, no. And choice D is kind of like, let me just go back to our last slide. Kind of like this last example, eating the chicken wings is what the boy is doing. Choosing males with loud, high-pitched improvisational songs is what female finches tend to do. Why not say female finches tend to choose males with loud, high-pitched improvisational songs? It's shorter, it's more direct, it puts the actor at the beginning of the sentence rather than down here at the end. A is our correct answer. B, C, and D are all passive. Now, if we're saying avoid awkward phrasing, what is the most awkward word of all time on the SAT? Well, it's being. I'm going to try to show you guys if I can. I don't know if I'll be able to do this correctly, but if you guys can see here, I've got a tattoo on my ankle that is the word being with a line through it, okay? Because being is often wrong on the SAT. It's a word that sounds kind of fancy to students, but it's usually a trap. And so you can almost always eliminate answers that include the word being, especially when you're dealing with things like grammar and in combining sentences. Let's take a look at an example here. So choice B, I'm immediately getting rid of. Caesar being instantly distinguishable? No. Bye-bye to being. That's another bye-bye. Now let's look at the other options here. So a trumpet then signaled the entrance of Caesar. His glittering toga and armor made him instantly distinguishable. Okay. Now, something like A. I mean, one thing we're going to talk about is that, colons are often good. But, adding in this, it was his, right? This is a kind of passivity rather than just saying his toga and armor made him distinguishable. Why say it was his toga and armor that? So I'm not a big fan of this construction. It's of course grammatically correct. It's just not that well stated. Let's see if we have other options. Now, what about something like D? Caesar instantly his glittering toga and armor became distinguishable. Well, that's not horrible in a lot of ways. It does kind of put, it doesn't have too much passivity in it. But I'm wondering if there isn't a problem here. And the problem is that the focus shouldn't be on his armor and toga becoming distinguishable. It should be on Caesar himself being recognizable to the audience, right? And so, if we kind of look at our context a little bit, we have all these actors portraying Roman citizens. How do we recognize Caesar? How does the audience know that this is Caesar? Well, it's because he was distinguishable by his glittering toga and armor. He was set apart from the rest of the soldiers. And therefore, C is best. It emphasizes the fact that, Caesar himself, rather than his toga and armor, right? The focus shouldn't be on his toga and armor being recognized, right? The focus should be on him being recognized. And C does that really well by putting this in a kind of, subordinate clause. Basically, the focus is still on him. This is kind of like extra information. In D, by setting up a semicolon, we're basically saying that this information is almost like equally as important as the information in the previous sentence. It's not. It's kind of less importance. And so I hope that really makes sense because that's a really key element of these questions. All right. Oh, one thing to notice too is that we said bye, but in this case, right, the exception, there is a kind of exception to the rule because here, it does make sense to use a kind of almost passive phrasing. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. All right, our next strategy is to use a colon. Make sure that you're familiar with the rules for colon use. Colons are often a great way to logically coordinate ideas because they set up explanations and they set up additional detail. So if we're thinking about question 18, living buildings do have one drawback. And, to set up an explanation like, I often think of a colon as saying like, well, what is that drawback, right? If we put a colon in here, it's basically saying, what is the drawback? And then the explanation's coming on the other side, a high price tag. And we don't have to have a sentence after a colon. We can just have like explanatory material. So A is correct. Here, as far as why B is wrong, again, remember our whole this issue. It's unnecessary to say, which can be summed up as, right, this is just too wordy. Repeating things like repeating information that's already been stated is often wrong in these questions. Still, a colon isn't always going to work, right? And you're still going to need to think about balancing out all the rules we've talked about because in choice D, for instance, this is super wordy, right? Let's take a look at our options here. So he was deeply interested in Russian culture and history. This was at a time in Russia when oral storytelling traditions were in decline. Well, let's take a look at our options. So option A, history in Russia. So if we choose option A, we're saying he was deeply interested in Russian culture and history in Russia. This is repetitive, right? If we say Russian culture, then Russian will also necessarily, that adjective, just erase a little bit. So that adjective will necessarily refer to both culture and history. This means Russian culture and Russian history, okay? So choice A is repetitive. It's unnecessary to restate the word Russian. Okay, Russian history at a time, maybe. Notice that C and this was, what is this? No, bye-bye. And D does the same thing. At this time in Russia, okay, well, we already know the focus is on Russia, so this is repetitive, and we're not using this by itself. One of our major I didn't even realize how prevalent this rule was, but over the course of making this video and making these slides, I've started to realize, okay, this is really, up there with being as a, by itself a no-no word in this kind of question. All right, guys, well, we finally made it to the end of our combining sentences lesson. Hope you guys learned a lot. Let's just review some of our big ideas. So we'll look at some review questions where we can test the concepts. So for these questions, I'd like you guys to think about which two answers are probably wrong. In 34, I'll just give you 10, 15 seconds, okay? So, should have been pretty direct. Your key clue was no to being, okay? Bye-bye, bye-bye. A and B are probably wrong. Well, I can tell you that they are wrong, okay? Now, even without looking at the question or without looking at the context paragraph, I kind of know the answer here is D. Why? Well, it's awkward to say weighing in at 15 grams in weight. That's really repetitive. Weighing in at about 15 grams in weight. We already know that we're talking about weight. So actually here, our correct answer is D. All right, take a look at question 4. We can use another one of our perhaps no-no words. So here I would get rid of choice D, right? No to this, and choice C by doing this. These are often wrong, right? All right, let's keep going. Just cross those off. So let's look at an easy question now. An easy combining sentences question, that is. Okay, I'm just giving you 5 seconds to answer this. Go. Maybe 10. Okay, the fact that I only gave you that limited time to answer this probably gives you a clue as to what to do. If this is, if you're running out of time on the test and you've got to move fast and you see something like this, shorter is better. We're just going to go with C here, okay? These others just, saying 1980 in which year, right? Everybody knows 1980 is a year. You don't need to say, the year 1980, the year when. Oh my gosh, look at how repetitive that is. It was then that. We can just say when, right? There's no need to restate, okay. We're kind of, notice that pattern, it was that. I think we've seen that pattern before. Let me just quickly go back and see if we can find that pattern. Okay, it was that. Yeah, it was this, that. This is a passive pattern and it's not good. Notice that in answer choice A here. So I just wanted to point that out to look out for that pattern. All right. All right, let's look at a medium question now. All right. So one thing that is immediately kind of striking me as bad is answer choice B, because like in addition to being able to, I mean we've got being of course, but one thing to think about too is like rather than saying in addition to being able to, they could just say and they can, right? Which would be a lot shorter, So um, now, if we said comma and they can, that would kind of be bad for another reason because from what I can tell, there is a logical relationship between these ideas. I don't want to just say one thing and the other. I want to kind of show through my answer how these things are related. And what I'm kind of noticing is that this gives details about how sensitive those detectors are, right? They're so sensitive that they can tell if a gravitational wave has compressed or stretched the distance to either mirror by just 1/10,000th. Wow, that's an extreme level of sensitivity, okay? Um, so, the best thing to do here, if we're getting extra detail or explanation about like how sensitive they are, our colon is actually best here, kind of showing, okay, the detectors are extremely sensitive. The colon means, well, how sensitive are they? And then the answer comes on the other side, okay? This is a little bit tricky because some people say A here. They say, oh, they're sensitive because the reason they're sensitive is that they can tell if a gravitational wave has compressed. Well, that's not really the reason that they're sensitive. The reason that they're sensitive is because they've been kind of like designed to be sensitive. This is more telling us the extent of their sensitivity and not telling us like that there's a cause and effect, like because they can tell this, they are sensitive. That's not the key idea here. So this is a real a tricky trap, frankly, in A. and they're not sensitive, the goal of their sensitivity is not to let them do this. They are simply sensitive, and this is one thing that they can do. All right. So D does not work either. I recognize that's logically tricky. All right. Let us keep going. Okay. Well, we already answered this question. If I'm not sure, yeah, we already looked at this question. So apologies. I've already shown you this one. So it's a repeat in the slides. Apology for that. I think that we'll just then move on to our final thoughts. So combining sentences questions. These are interesting questions because you're using a variety of skills. I'd like you to remember that these questions really are testing other styles of SAT writing skills in disguise, right? They're kind of secret transition word questions, or secret modifier placement questions, or secret concision redundancy questions, right? Where you're saying like, I myself personally style questions. So they're combining all of those different styles of question into one. Yeah. So last thing to remember the key strategies. One, try to make a prediction before you look at your answer choices. Shorter is better. Think about logical relationships. Focus on your transition words, and 3 and 4 kind of go together in that sense. Although, but, yet, those kinds of things. Avoid awkward phrasing. Remember the no-no words being this, that, these, those. And use a colon if it's appropriate. That's often a great way to link up ideas, especially if that second idea is an explanation of the first. You can have a you have to have a sentence before a colon, but you don't have to have one after. You could have a sentence or not. It doesn't really matter. All right, guys. Well, I hope you learned a lot. The final thing that I'll say is I'll be trying to put some combining sentences worksheets in the description, so feel free to check those out, and hope you enjoyed the video. Give me any comments for suggestions, things that you'd like me to cover, or things that you'd like me to change about the format of the video. Look forward to hearing from you, and take care. Bye-bye.